War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 53, Torch and the North African Campaign. As I may have mentioned earlier, the entire North African campaign was a waste. It violated the fundamental principle of objective. Berlin was the political center of gravity, and North Africa was nowhere near it, unless you think I am inherently a contrarian as opposed to usually a contrarian. My opinion was unanimously shared by the Joint Chiefs, led by General Marshall. They wanted to go straight to France in the spring of 1943, over a year before the ultimate overlord invasion, colloquially known as D-Day. Despite the fact the U.S. had a Germany-first policy, the reconquest of the Pacific was well underway, with Guadalcanal and the New Guinea campaign, the former by mostly Marines and the latter led by the U.S. Army, with significant Australian support. While Guadalcanal is probably the more famous battle, the loss of 20,000 Japanese and 7,000 Marines paled to the 202,000 Japanese killed in the latter, to 12,000 Australians and Americans. And from these early landings, lessons were learned. Foremost, the invader must outnumber the enemy, defending and maintain air superiority over the landing sites. These lessons were dearly paid for, and the concern for the military planners was how to maintain air superiority over landing sites nowhere near land-based airfields and with few carriers available. The cross-channel invasion, following the Nazi defeat in the Battle of Britain, made this far easier. But Roosevelt and Churchill were insistent. Churchill's reasonings were, at first glance, far easier to ascertain. British forces had been fighting Italian forces from the moment the Battle of Britain ended on the border between Libya, an Italian colony, and Egypt, a British quasi-colony/protectorate. To the west lay Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, all French colonies, aside from a small slice of Spanish Morocco directly across the Strait of Gibraltar. This would seem to make the Allies' task of invasion far easier, except for one minor point. The French government were allied with the Nazis at the time, with their new temporary capital at Vichy in the south of France. Churchill was rightly concerned with maintaining control of the Suez Canal, and the decision to invade was made in June of 1942, well before the victory at El Alamein, and in fact the meeting occurred at the same time Rommel's victory was secured at Tobruk, threatening Britain's position in North Africa. Furthermore, as noted previously, Churchill maintained a fascination with the strategic indirect approach and saw, for no possible good reason, that invading North Africa and Sicily and then through Italy would be easier than a cross-channel attack landing in France. Undoubtedly, Churchill's experience as both minister and infantry battalion commander in the trenches of World War I shaped his fears, and I have never abandoned a sneaky suspicion that Churchill wanted to ensure the fighting on the Eastern Front went on as long as possible, as Churchill had spent a political career denouncing the Communists and Stalin almost as strongly as denouncing the Nazis and Hitler. When questioned on this seeming incongruity, Churchill quipped, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." And Roosevelt just wanted to help Stalin. The relationship between Roosevelt and his administration with the Soviet Union is complex and deliberately ignored, it would appear. Some have surmised his primary advisor, Harry Hopkins, was a Soviet spy. There is no evidence for this. Rather, his work in supporting the Soviet Union at every turn appears to simply be of his own pro-communist accord. His was the loudest voice in Roosevelt's ear at Yalta, where the entirety of Central and Eastern Europe was handed over to Stalin's personal control following the war. But Stalin insisted on a second front, and North Africa appeared to be the location where this demand could be most quickly met. As with so many big things and big military operations, while Roosevelt and Churchill, again, over the objection of their military advisors, decided upon a North Africa campaign in June, it was not until November that the invasion took place. The planning and logistics were immense. The desire was to get as close to Libya as possible, but this meant a Mediterranean landing, which meant highly exposed troop carriers and logistics ships having to go through the Straits of Gibraltar, with Vichy French on one side and quasi-neutral but certainly kind of pro-Germany, Spain, on the other. And then the threat of Italian air and naval assets providing land-based support and no small amount of U-boats, which had managed to slip through the narrow passage. And, even should the invasion fleet make it through, the force would have to be resupplied somehow. And once the surprise of the invasion was over, this would appear to be an exceedingly difficult task. And even more challenging was the distance from the ports of embarkation to the landing beaches. A little bit of loggy nerd talk here. You have ports of embarkation, where cargo and personnel leave from, and then you have ports of debarkation, where said cargo and personnel offload and go do their thing. And now you have both C, ports of embarkation and debarkation, known by their acronyms SPO and SPOD, as well as airports, known as APO and APOD. Although it is, in our very expeditionary military, the pods, or ports of debarkation, that are the focus. In modern military planning, the SPOD is almost always the operational center of gravity for the away team. One of the massive challenges of Afghanistan was the lack of an SPOD. This necessitated overflights or road trains through Iran, Pakistan, or former Soviet states in order to resupply our forces. Fuel especially was a challenge. I've heard that to supply 1 gallon of diesel cost approximately $100. And with a military that insists on using multi-engine jet fighters to blow up 2 dudes on a motorcycle, this is almost criminally wasteful, but I certainly digress. The reason for the emphasis on the SPOD is that 90% of all logistics for sustained combat operations will come by sea. In Afghanistan, we ship the bulk of our logistics as close as possible and then air hop the rest in. While I was there, Russian contracted Antonovs flew several sorties per day delivering key supplies, most visibly MRAPs. In planning amphibious operations, the key tactical objective, beyond securing the beachhead, is to secure an established port to ensure logistics throughput matched to a road network. Getting things ashore was worthless if you couldn't move them inland. For D-Day, the port of Cherbourg was supposed to have been captured only days later, whereas in fact it didn't fall until the end of June, and the infrastructure so wrecked by the defending Germans that it didn't function until late August. As such, shipping from America had to go first to England, completely offload their cargo, reload them onto shallow draft shipping to be offloaded again at the Normandy beaches. In Korea, the defense of Pusan was critical, as it was the last remaining port in UN forces' hands. In Vietnam, we created the port of Cam Ranh Bay, as the existing infrastructure in South Vietnam was insufficient to support military operations. In more modern times, Qatar and Kuwait have served as SPODs for our various excursions in the Middle East. So for those of you planning any sort of amphibious operations in your near future, make the SPOD your focus. And so it was with Torch. North Africa isn't exactly a robust trading center. The Sahara Desert makes sub-Saharan traffic nearly impossible, and certainly illogical. As the major communities are all on the coast, it is far easier to simply have many small ports at each town and city, rather than one massive one. Then, as now, it is always better to go by ship, if you have the option. Oran and Algiers have always been the main cities of Algeria, but they were in the Mediterranean basin. Tunis was very well situated, as far east as possible, without actually getting to Libya, but too close to Italian air power, and thus too risky. The great fear of the Allied planners was to get ashore, but then have Spain shut down the straits into the Mediterranean, leaving an invasion force logistically abandoned. So they abandoned the concept of mass and went with a highly risk-adverse landing concept, which saw the Western Task Force, under General Patton, landing in French Morocco on the Atlantic coast, centered around Casablanca, which, incidentally, is one of, if not my all-time favorite movies, and definitely worth a watch if you have the time. The center and eastern landings were focused on Oran and Algiers, respectively, and were mixed British and American-led. The defense was all by Vichy French, whom, many assumed, wouldn't put up a fight against nominal allies, despite the fact that Vichy French had previously fought against the British in Syria and elsewhere. While not too keen upon defending themselves against the Nazis, there was no reason to believe they wouldn't put up another fight against an Anglo invasion force. Robert Murphy, the U.S. State Department liaison with the Vichy French, was confident they would not resist. The logistics was immense, and the bulk of the Western Task Force sailed not from Great Britain, but directly from the United States. While the 5 landing sites of Overlord on 6 June were separated by a scant 50 miles, there were over 1,000 miles separating the landings in and around Casablanca and those in Algiers. While mitigating the risk of a closure of the Straits of Gibraltar by landing at Casablanca, the landings were exposed to the extreme weather found on the eastern edge of the Atlantic. The main port of Safi, just north of Casablanca, was quickly seized only 2 days after the initial landings on the 8th of November in 1942. In the hopes of a bloodless attack, no preparatory fires were used. The French manned coastal defense batteries opened fire nonetheless on the advancing landing craft and landing troops, leading to a duel of batteries afloat and on shore. The attacking ships silenced the French guns in only hours. The French Navy made a decent attempt at a counterattack at sea, but the 100-ship fleet of the American Western Task Force quickly sank or forced aground the bulk of the French flotilla. The threat was not the French, but the sea. Over half the landing craft involved were lost to sea conditions. Fortunately, the defending French were not so formidable and surrendered only 2 days later. This paltry resistance would not be replicated in Algiers and Oran, however. In Oran, the Big Red One secured the initial beachhead, but a quickly rising tide and poor logistical coordination shut down additional landings. However, after sporadic but spirited sparring between the French and American infantry, the town of Oran surrendered due to no small bluff by the commander of the Allied forces and the surprising complete lack of air support for the French. Algiers was the most challenging of the objectives. Being the heart of French North Africa, it had the most robust defenses, to include hundreds of fighter aircraft, several airfields, and stout harbor defenses. Here the bulk of the attackers were British. In an interesting side note, Anglo-Franco relationships were at a decided low point. The British had attacked and sunk several French ships in the port of Oran right after the French surrendered to the Nazis, killing over 1,000 French sailors. After the French assured the British the ships would remain neutral and not join Germany's Kriegsmarine. The relationship was so bad that Churchill proposed British soldiers taking part in the invasion should wear American uniforms, a proposal ultimately rejected. Realizing the criticality of the port, the Allies created an audacious plan running 2 destroyers into the port at Algiers and dropping off a regiment of infantry and commandos. The first ship had no sooner disembarked the American infantry than the second ship was sunk. The American infantry, now isolated and without naval gunfire support, were forced to surrender. But within 2 days, the French managed to surrender yet again, and the torch landings, having lost 1,400 killed Allies and 700 French defenders, was over, with a significant first victory for the Americans in Europe. The landings are hard to criticize. The horrific seas on the Moroccan coast were a known hazard, and enough forces were available to take Casablanca by force had the Vichy not capitulated. Oran was seized with little initial resistance. An airborne battalion was flown over 1,000 miles from England and seized the nearby airfield at Tafaroui. A stiffening French defense and planned counterattack were again nullified by the Vichy commander's quick surrender. And Algiers, the toughest objective, was aided by confusion on the defenders' part. There were over 100,000 French troops strewn throughout the western half of North Africa. If not for the diplomacy and restraint of the Allies, Torch could have been a disaster. So the same mixing of politics into strategy that forced Torch in the first place also ensured it was a relatively flawless major amphibious operation, perfectly executed, despite the logistical hurdles, vast distances, and attempting a simultaneous series of landings separated by 2 different bodies of water and over 1,000 miles. The ground operations in North Africa deserve closer attention, and normally would follow this introduction. However, current events demand an analysis of the India-Pakistan conflict, heating up yet again, and one which I will go over next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.